What's going on, family? I'm Scrapbook Boxing. The Museum of the Forgotten Fisticuffs series will continue its conversation with you concerning the complete history of boxing. Now, we left off in the last video with Jimmy Welsh. Jimmy Welsh weighed 119 pounds. He had a record of 50 wins, 16 losses, and 20 draws. And we're going to look at a fighter that you're probably quite familiar with. The fight took place on a Wednesday night, May 23rd, 1912. The future world light heavyweight champion, Orchard Man, George Compartier, was 18 years old when he defeated 28-year-old Willie Lewis in New York. The contest took place in Paris, France. It was in defense of the European Boxing Union middleweight championship crown. Now, Willie Lewis was born May 21st, 1884 in New York. He would die May 18th, 1949. He was 64 years of age at the time of his death, and he would reside in New York. He had a total bout career of 134 bouts, 92 wins, 40 knockouts, 28 losses, and 14 draws. He would face the future middleweight champion, Al McCoy. Al McCoy would lose his crown to Michael Dowd out of St. Paul. We talked about that yesterday, and of course, Al Dowd would lose his title in 23 to a fighter by the name of the Pittsburgh Windmill, Harry Greb. Willie Lewis was 28 years old in this bout. He stood 5 foot 8 inches, had a 69.5-inch reach, had a record of 84 wins, 22 losses, 10 draws, and 37 knockouts. Willie Lewis fought a fighter by the name of Jeff Smith. Now, we talked about him. Jeff Smith was known as the Harlem Globetrotter. He was a phenomenal fighter. We would talk more about Jeff Smith as his career blooms. Jeff Smith was in a ring with Harry Greb 7 times. He had a hell of a career. We'll talk about him as this series goes by. As for George Compartier, he was 18 years old. He stood 5 foot 11 inches, had a 73-inch reach, had a record of 59 wins, 7 losses, 5 draws, and 32 knockouts. Willie Lewis was in a ring with fighters such as Harry Hairpin Lewis. Now, Hairpin Lewis faced fighters such as Benny Yanger, Joe Gans, Honey Boy Medley, and Mike Twin Sullivan, just to name a few. So that fight took place on May 23rd on a Wednesday night, 1912. June 6, 1912, the Commonwealth British featherweight champion, which was the version of the featherweight champion of the world, Jim Driscoll, knocks out France featherweight John Posky in 12 rounds. Now, that was at the National Sporting Club in Covent Gardens. It was for a chance of Jim Driscoll to get a shot at Owen Moran. It was for the EBU title, January 27th, 1913. And when that happened, the referee called it a draw. But for this fight that we're referring to, the referee was John Heppert Douglas. He stopped the bout. And Driscoll would get those championship belts. But it was the British recognition of the featherweight championship title. So Jim Driscoll, I don't know if I showed you an image of him. I will show you an image of him coming up, but he was something else as well. These are all European fighters. And European fighters can sometimes be left out of conversations, but they were outstanding fighters. In fact, they were better than outstanding. These are really, really good fighters, these European fighters. Sunday, June 23rd, Charles Ledux knocks out Digger Stanley. Knocked him out in 7 rounds to win the British EBU recognition of the featherweight championship title. Now, Charles Ledux, he was known as Little Apache. He was born October 27th, 1892 in France. He died May 21st of 1967 in France as well. He fought from 1909 to 1926. He had a total bout career of 131 bouts, 103 wins, 22 losses, 86 knockouts, and he was stopped 3 times with 6 draws. He was 19 years old. He stood 5 foot and had a 63-inch reach, had a record of 46 wins, 7 losses, 3 draws, and 37 knockouts when he was in the ring that night with Digger Stanley. As for Digger Stanley, he was 29 years old that evening. He stood 5 foot 5 inches, had a record of 64 wins, 9 losses, 9 draws, and 14 knockouts. That was some fight. We talked about Digger Stanley pretty often, and we will show you some images of Digger Stanley. Digger Stanley was another fighter who was unappreciated in today's conversation, but he was a big deal during his reign. He was very appreciated during his reign. And I just wanted to bring light to Digger Stanley as well as Charles Ledux. On a Friday night, June 28th, 22-year-old heavyweight bomb belly Billy Wales knocked out 22-year-old Dartford, Iowa heavyweight. His name was Al Palace. And his nickname was Bigfoot. After Wells had pounced down twice and he hurt him in the 3rd round, the referee, Billy John stops. He stops the contest in New York's Madison Square Garden, and that created an uproar. And they started to reverse the decision. They decided not to. And, the thing with me, with some of these fighters, Al Platts and some of the other names we'll be referring to were part of the White Hope Heavyweight Championship division. And once again, that took place between 1911 and 1915. Jack Johnson would lose to Jess Willard in Cuba Havana, 26 rounds. And once Jess Willard became champion, that White Hope Championship reign had went away. And I just thought that was, you add insult to injury. I mean, what are you doing here? This is crazy. But this is the world we live in, and this was the history that we are intrigued with. And it needs to be brought to your attention, and that's what I plan on doing. There's other things that I will modify, but for the most part, I'm going to tell you exactly what happened in this sport. On a Thursday night, July 4th, World Heavyweight Champion Jack Johnson of the Galveston Giant. He knocks out fireman Jim Flynn in 9 rounds. And the county sheriff will step into the ring and stop the contest because it got to a point where it was blatant, it was disrespectful, it was humiliating. The way fireman Jim Flynn was hopping around and headbutting Jack Johnson. Now the referee for this contest was Edward W. Smith. He would then go ahead and disqualify fireman Jim Flynn. He refused to do it at first because he was afraid of an uproar, so he kept making eye contact with the sheriff. The sheriff said, "To hell with this." He jumped in and said, "No more." And what made it worse, Jim Flynn was spouting out racial slurs, if you will. And he was calling Jack Johnson the N-word and yellow streak and monkey and everything you can think of while he was headbutting Jack Johnson. I don't know of Jim Flynn doing this before, but he did it that evening. And it was just, I'm surprised he wasn't suspended from boxing. He was just, it was a foul against his record, but it was, and that's what happened to black fighters during that time, specifically Jack Johnson, who was able to control these fighters, but Jim Flynn took it to another level. Now, Johnson was 34 years old. He stood 6 foot. He had a 74-inch reach. He had a record of 51 wins, 5 losses, 9 draws, 24 knockouts. He was in the ring with fighters such as Jim Jeffries, Stanley Ketchel, and Tommy Burns. Fireman Jim Flynn was 32 years old. He stood 5 foot 10 and a half inches, had a 69-inch reach. He had a record of 59 wins, 15 losses, 20 draws, 39 knockouts. And the biggest opponent in name recognition that he was in a ring with in the White Hope category was Carl Morris. Carl Morris was a big fella. And he was in the ring with a lot of fighters he was able to control because of his height. But Carl Morris, in fact, I'll show you images of him as well, was a pretty popular name during that time. Now, this contest was scheduled for 45 rounds. Fireman Jim Flynn. Who was he? His name was Andrew Haynes. He was born December 24th, 1879 in Hoboken, New Jersey. He died April 12, 1935. He was 55 years of age at the time of his death. And he would reside in Pablo, Colorado. He had a record of 141 total bouts, 72 wins, 45 losses, 56 knockouts. He was stopped 26 times and had 22 draws. He was in the ring with fighters such as Sam Langford, Fred Fulton, Carl Morris, Jack Dillon, Ed Gumbo Smith, Battling Levinsky, Luther McCarthy, and many others. He knew better. But this is what we were dealing with. Unfortunate. That was totally uncalled for, and it was disgusting is what it was. Now, on July 4th, 1912, lightweight champion Ed Wargas, the Michigan Wildcat, mixed it up with Mexican Joe Rivers at the Vernon Arena. Now, the thing with this fight, we'll get into it in a moment. He was born February 8th, 1888. He died April 14th, 1955. He was 67 years of age at the time of his death. And he stood 5 foot 4 and a half inches. He had a 65 and a half inch reach. He was from Cadillac, Michigan. Now, Ad Wargas, the Michigan Wildcat, some Cadillac, Michigan. He fought from 1906 to 1920. He had 60 wins, 13 losses, 40 knockouts. He was stopped 3 times and had 17 draws. Now, March 6, 1916, he was in a ring with Freddie Welch, which he lost. December 17, 1915, he was in a ring with Leach Cross, the fighting dentist, which he lost. March 31st, 1916, he was in a ring with Ever Hammer from Chicago. He was an outstanding fighter, was Ever Hammer. Ever Hammer, you had Charlie White. You had Ray Miller. A lot of very good lightweight Chicago fighters were very good during that time. But Ever Hammer was a very good fighter. Remember when he fought Benny Leonard? That was an outstanding fight. August 6, 1915, he was in a ring with Joe Willing, and he would lose to Joe Willing. July 23rd, 1915, he was in a ring with Rocky Kansas, who he would lose to. So those were the 5 losses that Ad Wargas would be in a ring with. They would defeat him. But he was something else. Adolfo Wargas, he was one of 7 children. The Mexican Joe Rivers was out of Los Angeles, California. He was born March 19, 1892 in Vernon, California. He died June 25, 1957. He was 65 years of age at the time of his death. He stood 5 foot 4 inches as lightweight and had a 68-inch reach. He had a career record of 78 total bouts, 40 wins, 24 losses, 21 knockouts, and he was stopped 6 times. He would lose to fighters such as Joe Benjamin, December 21st. He would actually defeat him in 11th Street Playhouse. I'm trying to remember this. November 20th, Joe Thomas, who he would lose to. December 8th, Richie Mitchell, who he would lose to. He would lose to Richie Mitchell, which was some fight. Richie Mitchell was a champion as well. January 24th, he fought Richie Mitchell at the Cincinnati Music Hall Arena, and he defeated him in 10 rounds. So Ad Wargas was a big name during that time. He wasn't the greatest fighter, but he would fight you, and he became champion. And like I said, he hired Jack Welch, who was a referee. And that's when they pulled that stunt with Mexican Joe Rivers. I'm Scrapbook Boxing, Museum of the Forgotten Fisticuffs series, stating all great fights, all great fighters will never be forgotten on my channel. We'll continue the complete history of boxing right here. Thanks for watching. Be well. Peace.